on this episode of Dr. J's Office Hours.
My first year, and this is really what the defining moment was, but my first year, I met a young person who, in a lot of ways, I saw a lot of myself in him. One of the challenges that he experienced is feeling isolated, feeling alone. Like myself, he identified as a black male. And then on top of that, he was very intelligent. You know, one of the biggest challenges he had, though, was trying to figure out how do you channel, should I say, that intelligence, those gifts, that wisdom that he was naturally born with in ways that are productive. And through our first year, we had ups and downs. But, you know, rather than as many educators or people I knew that had interacted with him had done before me, they would often push him away, right? They would label him as being a bad kid. But I remember this one day, I was passing out passwords to the kids, and I gave him his password. He had his laptop on his desk. He looked at the password, ripped it up, closed his laptop, and put his head down and started to cry. So I walked over to him to try to figure out what was going on. I picked up the ripped up paper and I pieced it back together. So I was like, oh, at least let me help you get you logged on. And on the paper was written, and I can't even make this up, this was a randomly generated password: bad, B-A-D 123. In his mind, this was like a sign from the heavens that he was a bad kid, that he's a bad human being. And you know what, I had to take him aside and really just love on him a little bit and speak power into his existence. And you know, at the end of that situation, he said the thing that really struck with me and sticks with me to this day and really set me off into really understanding how do we strengthen and improve our education system. But he said, "Mr. Howard, I wish that you were my dad."
Carlon, what's up, brother? How are you?
I'm good, man. I can't complain.
Dope, man. Thank you so much for your time and vibe with me in my office hours, stepping inside my office. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've, through research and just through mutual connections, I've heard some amazing things about you and the work that you're doing in the community. So I'd like to start our conversation off with what you feel as you reflect back on your career thus far. What do you feel is a defining moment in your life?
Yeah, man. So, you know, I was born and raised in Georgia. Well, you know, we say y'all and ain't, yes ma'am, no sir, all that good stuff. And I grew up and I had a relatively successful academic career, as you could say, K through 12 experience. You know, I went to a school, and the thing that really stuck out to me is I went to a school that was about 80% black by the time I graduated. But I was the only black male who was in the talented and gifted program at my school. You know, looking at that as a backdrop, and then also additionally to that, you know, my parents grew up, both started out in segregated schools in the South, ended up going to integrated schools as they got older, were some of the first students to integrate their schools, right? Like, I saw both this interesting dynamic between being able to have opportunities and also being restricted significantly to those opportunities. So I went to college thinking I was going to be a lawyer because I really wanted to address some of the issues I saw around racism and injustice, and I figured that law was the best way to do that. So I started out in criminal justice and political science, and then by the time I graduated, I had a quarter-life crisis where I was like, yo, I don't know what in the world I want to do with my life. A friend suggested I apply to this program with AmeriCorps called City Year. And I ended up moving everything I had. Originally, I applied to go to New York. They asked me if I'd come to Rhode Island, so I took everything I had and came to Rhode Island. I was like, why not? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I did City Year for a year, loved it, enjoyed it, loved working with youth. And I said, hey, I want to become a teacher. So I started my career as a teacher, or at least I guess my post-City Year AmeriCorps career as a teacher. And my first year, and this is really what the defining moment was, but my first year, I met a young person who, in a lot of ways, I saw a lot of myself in him. One of the challenges that he experienced is feeling isolated, feeling alone. Like myself, he identified as a black male. And then on top of that, he was very intelligent. You know, one of the biggest challenges he had, though, was trying to figure out how do you channel, should I say, that intelligence, those gifts, that wisdom that he was naturally born with in ways that are productive. And through our first year, we had ups and downs. But, rather than as many educators or people I knew that had interacted with him had done before me, they would often push him away, right? They would label him as being a bad kid. But I remember this one day, I was passing out passwords to the kids, and I gave him his password. He had his laptop on his desk. He looked at the password, ripped it up, closed his laptop, and put his head down and started to cry. So I walked over to him to try to figure out what was going on. I picked up the ripped up paper, and I pieced it back together. So I was like, at least let me help you get you logged on. And on the paper was written, and I can't even make this up, this was a randomly generated password: bad, BAD 123. In his mind, this was like a sign from the heavens that he was a bad kid, that he's a bad human being. And you know what? I had to take him aside and really just love on him a little bit, and speak power into his existence. And at the end of that situation, he said the thing that really struck with me and sticks with me to this day, and really set me off into really understanding how do we strengthen and improve our education system. But he said, "Mr. Howard, I wish that you were my dad." And that just really stuck with me, and I still to this day think about that all the time, of the power that educators have, the power that, folks who work in a space where they're caring for other people is immense. The idea that somebody could have such a strong bond and connection to you to the point where they want you to be their own flesh and blood, that is tremendous to me. And it has led me and launched me into a career in the education space, and understanding how do we bring human, should I say, humanity back into that space. Not that it's necessarily absent, but oftentimes the discussions and the debates that happen don't necessarily have to do with the actual lived experiences of the young folks who are going through our schools and our systems, right? And I really want to figure out how do we bring that back in the conversations and center young people and their lives, their lived experiences, and everything we do, rather than turning these things into political footballs and these big debates on theories and whatnot, but rather focus on what are people actually living and experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and how do we improve their circumstances and the events in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And that's such a powerful moment, and I can see why that would be a defining moment for you. For you, how did that impact you in terms of like taking yourself out of the classroom? Like, say you weren't an educator, because I feel like a lot of times, particularly with our young people, young men of color, we struggle to have that moment. Like that moment he had in the class, most young men don't even say like, how a father figure, how they long for a father figure or someone to, love on them in the way that they needed in a moment. And so for you, did you see, did that transcend the classroom? Were you able to sort of, put your emotion aside for being the professional, right, and the teacher, and just being that big brother or the uncle or the father in that moment? Because I know those are the moments as educators, like you said, we always remember them, but sometimes you get frozen in the moment, because it's like, if I have to say the right thing, this has to be the right time. I can't put too much, because then then we start thinking about the political aspect and professionalism and all of those things in an instant, right? And so what was that like for you as you moved through that emotion and that empathy for that student? And then how did that translate to, how you moved in the world with young men in general?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, man. So, when I look back at that particular moment, I got emotional, right? Mm-hmm. Because, in that particular moment, here's somebody who's putting their heart on the line, who's taking what could potentially be a significant risk by really expressing themselves. Because oftentimes, particularly when you think about men and black men, right, like we're not put into spaces or feel comfortable sharing our deepest feelings and the things that are going through our minds at the time. And for me, I've just felt really connected. And I remember, because it was right, but his mom was also about to pick him up. So I was just like, hey, man, I'm here for you. We left it at that, and he got picked up, and we continued our relationship beyond that. But I think of, one of the things I thought about when you asked that question too is like, it really charged me up in a way that is indescribable. And what I mean by that is you know, for many folks, it may be like, hey, because I ended up leaving the classroom down the road a year later after I met with had that student as my student. And when I left the classroom, though, you know, what I kept thinking about, because when I left, the Philando Castile murder was all over news. I remember watching it and just been depressed for a week, and I hate that I even looked at it, to be quite honest. But just thinking, like, in this day and age, in our time, oftentimes as a black male, and this is something I personally relate to, you can do everything right. You can say everything right. You can do well in school, and then you can still be labeled as a threat, right? And that was the case with Philando Castile. And then, you know, when I reflect back on that young person, that's how I saw what his situation was too, is that no matter how hard he tried, he always felt like he was always going to be labeled as a bad person, as a threat. And looking at that, you know, where I was really conflicted is like, our schools, at least in the schools I was working in, are we doing more harm than good? Number one. And number two, is there a way for me, using my experience, the skills I have, all these good things, that I can really make a bigger change, a monumental change on a larger level? Not to say that, you know, being at the classroom level, you can't do that. I absolutely believe you can do that. For me, it was just like I felt moved and called. It was almost like something that was pulling me to say, like, there's a journey you need to take in order to ensure that what's happening to that young person that you work with, what's happening to Philando Castiles of the world, right? That doesn't continue to happen down the road. That doesn't continue to be a trend. And, you know, right now, as we know, it still is a trend. And I'm always thinking about it from the education standpoint, the system standpoint, because at some point, every single one of these young men who were saying being brutally beaten and murdered were in a school at some point. They had teachers at some point, right? They were somebody's student at some point. And, you know, I can't help but to think, if I had an opportunity to be with them as their teacher, right, or someone like me, how different those lives could have changed, or even the individuals who were the aggressors in those matters. At some point, they were students. At some point, they were somebody's classroom, right? Even for them, right? Like, what if I had, or some folks like me who came from the mindset that I came from, who had this deep level of empathy and love for people, were able to show them, like, oh, you don't have to be like this. It don't have to be like this. You know, people care for you, and we here for you. That's what really has driven me to this day to really, you know, work on what I work on and do what I do.
So tell me a little bit more about what you do, you know, your organization, and what you do within your organization.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, so my official title is Chief Impact Officer for Equity Institute. We focus on implementing and designing innovative solutions for promoting diversity, equity, inclusiveness in schools, learning communities, and just communities in general. We have a number of different ways we do that. We do trainings and workshops. We do assessments for schools, districts, organizations. We have pathway programs for folks who are interested in becoming teachers. We do networking events for folks who are trying to figure out different ways to connect to different community resources and opportunities. And then on top of that, we're always thinking about ways that we can really do the work better, right? And what I mean by that, how can we go deeper in the communities that we work with and serve? You know, our big focus when you think about vision is that we believe or envision a world where folks can show up as they are in their identities and be seen and heard, right? They can be validated, because when you really break it down, all of us as human beings, right, as social beings, that's what we want, right? We want to be seen and heard. We want to be appreciated. We want to be loved on. We want people to hear who we are, right? And to really look deeply and really recognize our humanity. Because the truth is like, you know, this comes from a South African proverb, but right, I'm only human through the eyes of other people, right? My humanity is tied to yours.
Ubuntu.
And exactly. Appreciate that. Right. So when you think about the work that we're doing, that's what we're working towards. And like I said, we mostly at the root of everything that we do is about learning and education and providing people with critical insights, transformational experiences to really learn about themselves first and foremost, right? And to understand how the world around them has shaped their identities, and with that knowledge, that awareness, being able to enact change themselves and their communities.
That's beautiful. And it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the organization's framework as it relates to connecting with people really strays away from a deficit framework and really focuses on the positive aspects of what this person brings to the table by encouraging them to bring their full selves, encouraging them to sort of be their authentic selves in every moment in order to best serve them. You know, I feel like a lot of times when we have these conversations around equity and inclusion, we tend to look at what the institution doesn't have. And a lot of times when you focus on what it doesn't have, you miss all the gems and the talent and the gifts of what's already there. It's more so, how can we provide a platform or a space for those things to flourish? And so how have you seen, since you've been there at this institution, sort of the change of your own lived experience, what you want to do in the world, and now, you know, in this position, have you been able to see actual impact and change through your lens, and how does that inspire you to keep going? Because I can imagine this type of work in all these different facets, classroom, community, you know, professional development, could be a lot. It could be a lot to juggle. So how's the change sort of, and have you seen change, one, and then how has that change inspired you to continue?
Yeah, no, I appreciate your question. So yeah, my partner and I, we founded this in 2019, really officially launched in 2020. And at the time it was just her and I, and really trying to figure out how do we really have the impact we want to have, right? And at the time we had kind of two different programs. One was about teacher diversity, and the other one was more about training and development for teachers already in the classroom. And we've grown from us two over the 3 years ago, back in 2020, to now we have about 10 full-time staff members. And now over the past few years, as we've grown as an organization, now we're starting to see the fruits of our labor. So, you know, to start with, when we started our kind of teacher diversity work, which now we call TA to BA, we've grown that for 15 people in the first year to now over 70, right? And then next year, with intentions to grow that to 150 just in the Rhode Island area. And we're partnering with a local institution called College Unbound, to really implement this innovative curriculum and learning experiences for folks who are paraprofessionals, youth workers who work in schools but don't have a bachelor's degree or the certifications necessary to be the teacher of record. So we've seen, just by the sheer volume, the numbers have grown because people are interested in our work. And one of the beautiful data points that we're definitely anticipating in the near future is to see those graduates start to finish up our program, graduate, get jobs, and then elevate their careers, right? Because for most of our folks, they're coming in making $28,000 a year, getting a bachelor's degree, getting teacher certification, they become a teacher. Now they can make around $46,000 on average a year, which still isn't a lot, but when you go from $28,000 to $46,000, that can be a life-changing trajectory that allows you to really start to engage in this path of upward mobility beyond just this particular moment. We also, you know, one of our early programs too was, at the time we called it Edu Leaders of Color Rhode Island, now it's called Regeneration. But it was all about engaging people from across different sectors with the intent to really center the experiences of folks who have been minoritized and historically marginalized, and to provide them with the perspectives of folks across the community who are doing work and connect them with different resources and opportunities. You know, when we first started, you know, we're talking, you know, 30, 40, 50 people, and that we really started that back in 2016. Right now, we've engaged on a yearly basis, you know, few hundreds, thousands even of people, right? So folks are really engaging in our work in that area. We also have our what we call root cause equity analysis, where we're going to schools and districts and we're doing almost like these little research projects to really understand how can they strengthen the work that they're engaged in as educators, and how they can also find ways to improve. We've worked with 7 school districts, I believe, just in our kind of regional area here, and the majority of them have all taken the reports that we've been able to develop and generate and take action to some degree with them, right? So when I think about impact, there's all those little and even big things that are happening where it's spreading, right? Like we're seeing this big level spread. Right now it's mostly regional in the New England area, and now we're really trying to figure out how do we elevate our impact and really support others across the country in doing similar work too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I used to have a lot of conversations around this idea of panic and patience. And panic, not so much in a literal term, but this sense of urgency when we're talking about, minoritized or marginalized communities. But also, as you mentioned earlier, there's this patience that has to come in terms of allowing things to grow and for sustainability purposes, right? Because a lot of times, particularly in DEI work, folks get satisfied with a box being checked, right? And it's because there's a panic, because it's a sense of urgency. Okay, we need these amount of people in this space. Okay, that's diverse. We need these amount of, accessibility tools so these folks can have equity, right? There's a thing. And then, okay, let's invite these people to the conversation to have them included. But a lot of times it's not sustainable. And so how have you sort of created a framework or infrastructure that when you go into these schools and when you go into these districts, or you connecting with these different stakeholders in and around the community, the reporting, how does that then translate to a sustainable model that can go long after you leave from your position in sort of consulting or advising a particular institution?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And a lot of what we're trying to do and think about is, right, like we don't want to be the heroes, right? Like, and I think that's oftentimes how folks get positioned in the DEI work, right? People anticipate them coming in, being the heroes, swooping in, saving the day, leaving, as you mentioned, even they check the box and then they're out. The root of our work is all about storytelling, right? And storytelling is as old as humankind is, right? And that's the root of our work, right? So when we're going into schools and districts, right, we're not just coming in to give folks, for instance, like quick data points that they can say, all right, well, 80% of our kids are doing this, we need to have 85% doing that, right? We're coming in and we're really trying to go through if you're looking at it from a research standpoint, collecting qualitative data, right, to really understand people's lived experiences as they engage with whatever school or district we're working with, right? And that is the foundation of everything that we're doing, right? Our what we call our TA to BA program, right, is really it's really focused on the stories of the folks who are going through our programming, right? Because their narrative has been that because of their age, right, they can't go back to school, it's too difficult, right? Like they're not going to be successful. Right, many of them started college but never finished, right? So there's all these stories around them, and we're trying to help them reframe those narratives, right? So for us, when we think about sustainability and all those things, we're thinking about how do we really elevate the narratives of the folks who for so long have felt voiceless, and once they can build that particular skill, right, being able to tell their story and being authentic about their storytelling, and also having that being a way that districts and school leaders and educators are able to communicate with each other, right? Not just on the simple fact of, hey, let's talk about all these data points, right? Like that has some validity in all of this. But to me, what's more important is what are the stories that we're telling about our kids? What are the stories we're telling about each other, right? What are the stories that are really going to allow us to really push forward? And you'll see that in the work that we produce is that it tells a different story that varies from what we've traditionally seen, even in the DEI space to some degree, right? Of saying like, we're looking at the lived experiences of folks, and we want to elevate that, and we want to really highlight, right? Like, you may say, like, you're all about dignity and accountability and all these other things, right? But that's not what people are saying they feel. Really, what people are saying they feel is they feel threatened. They feel like if they say anything, they're going to be reprimanded, right? They feel like they have no power or no say in decision making, right? Or on the other side, they may feel like, yo, this is a strong community. I feel accepted here. I feel like everything that is happening really honors who I am, right? Or they may say things like, this particular person, if it wasn't for them, I don't know where I would be. They've been an inspiring figure to me, right? Like, we're capturing those stories, and that's really what we're trying to bring to the forefront, is the power of stories, the power of storytelling as a way to really shift education. Because when you think about it, a lot of things that we see, it's all about the narratives, and when I look at what's happening on the mainstream level in the education space right now with the headlines and all these other things, right, it's certain people trying to push a certain narrative about what our work is and other people's work is, and it's having a huge impact, as we're seeing, in terms of the way people perceive what could be best for their communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would like to dig in a little more, because I love what you said, because I love stories, and I'm really big on storytelling. But a lot of times when we have these conversations, folks are talking about the external stories, like stories they telling about each other, versus the stories we tell ourselves. And I would love to get your perspective on, when you go into these institutions, they have some idea that there's some sort of problem.
Yep.
Which is why you guys are called in. What have you seen with these various institutions about the stories that they tell themselves? Because the stories that they tell people, that's one thing, and you can manage that to some level, but that almost is really a symptom of the story that they're telling themselves, right? And how do we sort of unpack that to really get down to true sustainable change? How have you approached that, in what aspects have you seen that in the school systems?
Yeah, another great question. The initial things that we do with people in terms of trainings and workshops and all these things, right? They're really about social cultural awareness. They're about identity, your own identity, right? Because we operate from the belief that the only way you can begin to understand the world around you is by understanding how the world has shaped you, right? And in a way, what you're getting at too is that the way we perceive ourselves to be are based on these stories that we've told ourselves, right? So what we try to do and what we work on is helping people build awareness of those stories, helping people really understand, like, all right, I think I'm this way or that way, or I do this or that because of a story that I believe or a story that I've bought in, right? And we try to get people to also just understand there's kind of two levels of stories here. There's the stories that we tell ourselves, and then there's the stories that are handed down to us that we also buy into and believe, right? I use the example of money, right? You think about it, money in and of itself, the dollar itself is just paper, right? Like, you can't eat it, right? Like, you can't burn it for fuel, right? You can't really, it has no functional use. But there's a strong story behind money that has lasted for generations, that has made it, quote unquote, valuable, right? And that's a story that many of us have believed in. And oftentimes we are very unaware that we have these stories about money, right? And then what's on top of that, we also have these emotional connections to it. In the same way, that's how identity is, right? When you think about identity, it's not something you can hold. It's not a tangible thing, right? It doesn't stay the same forever, right? When my parents were born, they used to call black folks colored folks, right? And then as they got older, then they became African Americans and Black Americans, right? Because these are the stories that, in a way, we have shaped, and the stories that have shaped us, and we want people to really understand that. And as they go out into the world, they have this framework, this lens of seeing the world as not necessarily as like these fixed identities and these things that stay the same forever, but as stories and information and knowledge that has been communicated both from them based on things that they've learned and from the outside world, right?
I love that. And a lot of times when folks hear about work the type of work that you're doing, a lot of times we get very divisive in thinking at it in very black and white terms, literally and figuratively, right? But there are also so many intersectionalities that go within that when we're talking about marginalized or minoritized communities. How have you sort of learned in that process? Because I feel like intersectionalities and how people identify themselves is this ever evolving, ever changing sort of concept and experience. And so I think we are, particularly after George Floyd, the collective consciousness is very cautious on how we address certain sensitive topics, whether it be about race or sexual identity or political, biases around, what is the right thing to do? What should be taught in the classroom? What should be taught at home? Like, right? Like all, banned books. There's all these different things, right? And so how have you educated yourself in keeping up with, the trends? And I cringe even when I say a trend, because someone's identity, I can't connect that to a trend, but you get what I'm saying in terms of like, there's these ebbs and flows in the collective consciousness of our society that says, okay, LGBT is the thing now. Oh, okay, all right, women's rights is the thing now, right? There's always a thing of the time. And so how have you sort of navigated that in this very important work that you're doing?
No, that's a great question. For me, it really starts with self-awareness, right? So I've spent a lot of time over the past years really digging deep and trying to understand myself, and that has taken the form of meditation, that has taken the form of reading a wide range of books, has taken the form of engaging with conversations with people older than me, people who are my age, people younger than me. It's also taken the form of journaling and writing what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking. And processing my thought processes and really grappling with some of the things or the ways that I've learned over time to be. And through that process, I've also had to unlearn a lot of things, right? There's just a lot of things as growing up that I learned about who I believe myself to be that just wasn't true, right? And so going through this process of developing self-awareness, it was all about really understanding that who I am as a person is constantly changing, it's constantly evolving, right? And being aware of it, right, is the best way to actually really understand who I am, right? Because I would never say like, right, there's no point where I can get to a place where I'm like, oh, I know everything about myself, I know everything about the world, right? Because there's always gonna be something new, right? The world's always constantly changing. So when I develop that awareness, when I'm in that place of awareness, I know I have choices, right? I know I have choices on how I want to react to certain or act on certain things, right? I have choices on how I want to show up in the world. I have choices on the person I want to be, right? But I can't make those choices if I don't have that awareness of who I am, who I'm constantly becoming, who I have been in the past, right? And then once I realize I have those choices, I'm able to make those choices with this clear awareness, this clear insights. Then I'm able to have true transformation, right? And I'm able to get to this place where I'm constantly growing and I'm constantly thriving. So when I see a lot of the things that, as you mentioned, kind of movements and changes and shifts in terms of our lexicon, in terms of, when we think about quote unquote social justice, right? What I really think about is like, how do these things impact me, right? And how do I want to choose to engage with those things, right? And how can I see the humanity that may be at the center of all of these things, right? What are people really feeling, right? When we see the movements that are happening, there's definitely some pain and suffering that is at the root of those things. How do we uncover that, right? What is the pain and suffering I'm experiencing that make me gravitate towards certain things or detest certain things, right? And as I unpack those things more and more and more, right, as the world changes and shifts, I can be like water. I can take up space, right? I can empty the space of the glass of water, if you will, right? A rock gets thrown into me, right? May get a little frazzled in a moment, but then I find my calm and my peace, right? So it's really about awareness for me. And once I have that awareness, I can make choices. And once I can make choices about who I want to be and how I want to show up in the world, then that's where I tap into transformation.
Wow, that's wonderful. And from your experience, how has folks sort of taken in your recommendations or the things that you have suggested for change? Because a lot of times I feel, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, when you look at like an equation of particularly around student success, and success can mean a lot of different things, but we'll say like academic achievement, and you look at a school district or a particular institution and they're struggling academically, you know, folks are barely passing, they have standardized testings and all of that. But that's one aspect. But then there's this other aspect of like, well, is it the educators? Is it the resources? Like there's all these different things. And a poem that comes to mind, I don't remember it word for word or who said it, but it's basically because I ain't got a pencil, right? Mm-hmm. The teacher was getting on the student for not having a pencil, and the student shares that, you know, did you know that I didn't have lights in my house? Did you know that I have all these brothers and sisters? Did you know that I didn't have breakfast, right? And you're complaining about a pencil, and you don't actually know that it's a blessing that I'm even in this class, that I even made it to the class because of what I had to get through to even be here, right? And so how do we as educators, as parents, as a community, right? It takes a village to raise a child. How do we look at something like academic achievement and start peeling back the things that are actually impacting that student from getting from point A to point B in their day-to-day, activities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's difficult, right? Because, you know, I think one of the biggest challenges with our education system is that, right, of all the different institutions in our political systems, if you will, and governmental systems, etc., right, schools are often the ones that are tasked with solving all the world's problems, right? Because you have kids who are coming into your schools, into your districts, who have a myriad of challenges that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, right? And depending on where the school is located, right, you can also end up with vastly different economics at play as well, which can have these huge implications for how the school is able to operate and serve students effectively. I will say, you know, the partners that we've worked with have taken the work that we've done relatively well, right? Like, what's always fascinating is in communities where they're more racially, economically isolated, right? Those communities have probably taken onto the work the most, right? Because the demographics that they serve. But in communities where more affluent, if you will, you have folks who do want to push back a decent amount, because to them it's like, well, you know, we have resources, money, etc. You know, we're good. But you know, when you look at a lot of schools like that, you also have a number of students who don't feel always welcome and don't feel like they belong, right? And you still want to be able to address those things as well. So all that to say is, like, you know, when we talk about what we do, it goes back to what I said earlier, which is about storytelling, right? Is we don't just look at, you know, test scores and academics and say, all right, you're doing good or bad based on all kids reading on grade level. We try to dig deep, and you know, that's the reason why we call it our root cause equity analysis, because we're trying to figure out what's the root cause of why students have, you know, reading scores that are this low or even this high. What is the root cause why none of your students know basic arithmetic, even though they're about to go into high school, right? What's the root cause of why students feel like they may not be able to be their full selves in schools and districts? And it's not to say that there's right or wrong answers in all of that. It goes back to what I said earlier, which is more about the awareness, right? So how do you make sure that you have this certain level of awareness so that as you push forward and as you work to improve your school, your district, all those good things, you know where you're coming from. You know what are the dynamics that are at play. You know the externalities that you may not have any control over, but you can try to figure out and design ways to actually build an environment that is still able to be successful in ways that your community defines success in light of all of the challenges that are happening on outside of the school doors, right? So to us, it all just comes down to, we want to unpack all those things that are leading to certain levels of achievement and opportunities, all these other things, right? And get to the root cause of those things, and then help people build their awareness and get the information, knowledge they need in order to sufficiently serve people in a way that is intentional and not in a way where they're just jumping to snap judgments, essentially.
I love that. And so what advice could you give to young people? A lot of our listeners are those in college or undergrad and grad school looking to enter a professional world. We know we need more of you in the world, right? We need more folks who are doing this type of work from all different backgrounds, all different walks of life. And so what advice would you give a young person looking to be involved in diversity, equity, inclusion, academic, student support, supporting young people in communities? What advice would you give them that they should have prior to entering this work? Because we know it's obvious this work is challenging and it could take a lot out of you. So there are some things where people see the person doing it, and oftentimes, particularly in the Black community, I can speak for myself, is that we make things look easy. We just navigate, we go along about it, but I'm good, we straight, right? You know how we talk, right? Yeah. But at the same time, you talked about earlier about meditating and sort of staying grounded and different things like that. I think a lot of times we need to really equip our young people who are entering this space with the tools for their own self-preservation so that they can do this work. But a lot of times they don't know how. They don't know how. They just hear that, the work is being done, but prior to the work being done, there's some inner work that has to happen. Could you share some advice or some recommendations with our audience about how you, show up for your work and the things that keep you grounded?
Yeah. So I think it's a matter of figuring out how do you really honor the different aspects of who you are, right? So that's your physical well-being, right? Your intellectual well-being, your emotional well-being, your spiritual well-being, right? So if any of those things get off of whack, you start to waver, and they will, right? They will at different points. That's just life. But always being aware and conscious so that you can adjust as necessary. So, one of the things I think is very necessary, which people don't really think about it when they, right? I think a lot of times people think about embarking on this work is just about, let me get as much knowledge as possible and really understand all the lexicon, the terms, the theories, the ideas. But really it's about making sure you're healthy, right? Making sure that you're physically active, right? Maybe that's just taking walks on a regular basis, but doing something to get your body moving if possible, or just like, doing something where you're really honoring your body, taking care of your body. Because if your body is taken well care of, right? People often talk about the mind-body connection. If your body's well taken care of, that's going to support your mind, right? Which moves me to the intellectual piece, right? Like, make sure that you're also staying read up. Always be a constant learner. Never stop learning. Never feel like you ever reach a point where you can't learn anything, right? And that can also take the form of just having conversations with people, listening to podcasts like this, right? There's a lot of opportunities in our world to learn new things, and it's also important to understand how to discriminate between those things, because not everything that we ingest in terms of knowledge and information is always the best for us, right? And then emotional well-being. For me, like I said, I went the route of meditation and journaling, and I learned this, probably a good 2016 is when I started first meditating and get into an active routine with meditating and journaling. For some folks, it might be having a therapist, right? I'm also formally trained as a leadership and performance coach. So for other folks, it might be having a coach, a personal coach that they can meet with on a regular basis to talk about who they are and who they want to be. Whereas, with therapy, you're also unpacking your past. It may just be having a good set of friends that you can call upon and engage with. And then spiritual, when I talk about spiritual, I don't mean necessarily like religion or anything, but what are the things that really make you come alive, right? So that may be, some of the routes such as religion and things of that nature. But it also could just be you being able to go outside and connect with nature, right? Spending some time really just appreciating the scenery that you're in, right? It can also just be sometimes just really going to a coffee shop and just appreciating that you exist as a person on this earth. It could just be as simple as just noting the things that you're grateful for on a regular basis, right? There's study after study that shows just by expressing gratitude on a regular basis in this genuine way, right, it can change our entire way of being and our way of thinking. about the world around us, right? So those are the tangible ways I would suggest, and having a routine around those things. So for me, 2 hours in the morning before my kids, my family's up, I'm doing those things, right? I'm going to the gym, I'm working out, making sure I'm eating healthy, right? I'm reading, I'm meditating, I'm journaling, I'm planning for the day, right? And I'm also just reflecting on life and who I want to be as I continue to grow older, right? And having a consistent routine around that will help you always strengthen and stay sharp and get stronger every day.
And what books are you reading to help you stay abreast to what's going on, whether it's spiritually, mentally, intellectually?
No, that's a good question. So Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown is a book I've been reading and have read and read over again. I appreciate the ideas that are shared in that particular piece of literature. Another one by author named Bettina Love called We Want to Do More Than Survive. She's an educator who writes phenomenal, exactly, who writes about it's history, it's philosophy, it's theory, practice, everything just into one space, right? And a great book when you're trying to think about a framework as you want to exist in the world. It's a great place to start. And then the last one, and this is a kind of a throwback book, but Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois. So, this was a book I read a while back, and I still return to it from time to time. But, a lot of things that he wrote in this book, right, are still things that we're seeing inform today, right? A lot of the ideas that he had and beliefs that he expressed in that book are still things that are relevant today. And what's powerful about that book to me is that, even though W.E.B. Du Bois was an intelligent person, a scholar, academic scholar, a PhD in all these things, right? The book is written as almost this creative piece of literature. And it's a relatively easy read that intertwines history and philosophy and poetry and art, and provides people a perspective of how narratives and thoughts and ideals were 100 years ago, and how those things still are relevant today.
I love that. Let me just put this in real quick. And my last question for you, and I know it's gonna throw you off a little bit, but I'm curious to know, if you were to have dinner with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Yeah, that's a tough one right there. That's a tough one right there. Something that, and this is something that more recently I came across, and I was actually on a flight and I discovered this documentary. But there's this guy who used to be the city council chair for Atlanta. His name's Marvin Arrington Sr. I know you were based in Atlanta, so you may even heard of him at one point, but you used to call him Bowlegs. And he is somebody that drove a lot of economic development in Atlanta, and he's somebody who in a lot of ways is responsible for what we've seen Atlanta become today in terms of the more positive attributes with Black Americans in terms of wealth and class and political influence, power, etc. Right? A lot of things that were put in place were done under his tenure as city council president or chair in Atlanta. But yeah, I watched this documentary, was just blown away because I had never heard that history, and was just fascinated that here's a guy who was an attorney in Atlanta who also ran one of the largest Black attorney or law firms in the country, who is also in a way the mastermind behind a lot of the Atlanta development that we see today. He's somebody I'm just curious about his experiences and picking his brain and learning from. And not to say we're all flawed. I'm sure he has his flaws and all those things. So definitely not to say like he's perfect in any way, but rather someone I'll be very interested in learning from and hearing of his experiences and how he navigated spaces as a Black man from Georgia in a space that was, at least when he was younger, highly segregated, right? And then becoming someone who is extremely successful, at least in conventional terms.
Dope. And I have to, comment, because I'm looking at it and I'm trying to figure out who's on your sweatshirt. Is that James Baldwin?
Yeah, James Baldwin. Yeah,
Yo,
favorite. So that would have been
that.
another one right there. James Baldwin.
And the reason why I brought that up is because I'm not sure if you read this book. I actually have it here. It's called
Begin Again. Yep. I have.
That's a great book. When you talked about W.E.B. Du Bois and his work being so poignant and relevant even to today, even though it was written so far so long ago. When I read Begin Again through the lens of Dr. Eddie Glaude's experience, talking about James Baldwin and the work that he does, it creates this relevance of these authors and these orators and these intellects, that it's amazing that they were so gifted in that time, but then it saddens at the same time because the things they were talking about are still relevant today in terms of the struggle and the challenges and the upward mobility of folks of color. So I was curious if you had that connection with his work, as well as the work that you're doing day to day.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So I really got into James Baldwin probably around 2017. It was just, I read everything James Baldwin wrote. Even at one point, I started a blog to really unpack my thoughts around James Baldwin and process my thoughts around his writings. But yeah, James Baldwin has been a huge influencer because in particular, he's a literary genius in my mind. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, especially in the community I was raised in, I grew up in, is like oftentimes we don't see ourselves as writers, right? We don't see ourselves as authors. And when I got a chance to engage with his work and really reflect on my own capabilities as a writer, right, he helped me see myself as a writer, right, and helped me see myself as somebody who can produce these wonderful works of literature. And even to this day, I love writing. And it's why I got into journaling, as I mentioned before. Part of the reason why is because of the power I find in putting pen to paper, right? Because versus like speaking out your thoughts, let's say in like a voice memo or something like that, you have to really think when you write, and it forces you to really process your thoughts in a way that's often difficult when you're in conversation.
Yeah, I love that. Man, this has been such a wonderful conversation, man. I appreciate your time and your wisdom and you just sharing your lived experience. I'm sure our listeners got so much they could pull from and reference for the future. I'd have to ask, how would people get in connection with you, your organization, in case they will want to engage with some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, so folks can go to our website, www.the, so THE, Equity, EQUITY, Institute, INSTITUTE.org. Or check me out on LinkedIn. If you Google my name, Carlon, CARLON, Howard, HOWARD, I should pop up there. At least you should see my name, and Chief Impact Officer, Equity Institute. Feel free to connect with me there as well.
Okay. Cool, man. Well, once again, thanks for your time. I appreciate you, brother.
Same. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. For more amazing content and episode updates, be sure to subscribe. Also, if you like notes from this episode and more, head over to drjwilliams.com and download Dr. J's Gems. The notes include a breakdown of the conversation, key concepts, and helpful resources, exclusively for my Office Hours fam. So come through. You never know. You just might learn something new. Talk to you soon. Peace.